Hi and welcome to Module 2 for SPED 780. Today what I want to do is just talk through some of the questions that you're going to see in the quiz that you're going to answer after you look at the Special Ed Services Process Handbook. And I really debated whether or not to provide additional detail, but I feel like this is so important for you as a secondary special ed teacher to really understand the law. And it's something that we really have to spend time in, especially time in that process handbook, really getting to know it. I remember when I first started teaching in a special ed classroom, I felt like I was pretty confident in the law. And then spent a couple of years teaching in that classroom, then went to the district level and spent a portion of my time doing compliance review on IEPs. And then I really dug into that process handbook because I was really looking at things that the state was going to find that we were not doing adequately in our IEP development. And man, I realized I did not know the law as well as I really needed to. So during this week, as you look at this and you think about these quiz questions, I want you to really read closely that process handbook. You're going to want to reference to it with APA referencing when you're answering these questions, but I'm also going to go through the questions and just pinpoint some critical pieces that I really want to make sure you understand. So I'm just going to walk through those questions. You can print it off and come back to this video if you want to have them in front of you. But the first question we're looking at is, what is the state-imposed rule about post-secondary goals and transition services? Well, you know that when students turn 14, we need to have those in place. So we need to have post-secondary goals, transition services that are measurable, okay? And that transition service also includes a course of study and the needs that the student is going to have to be able to achieve those post-secondary goals. Now, the other important thing to remember is when students reach 16 or younger, if it's determined by the IEP team, we need a statement of needed transition services, okay? And any agencies that are going to help with those transition services need to be included and listed in the IEP. So if you have some kind of work program that the students are going to participate in through an agency, or if they need some assistance with independent living from an agency, you're going to want at 16, you're going to want to start listing those agencies within the IEP and having those transition services identified. It's really critical. The other important piece to this, when we look at those post-secondary goals, transition services, we really want to get student input on this when we can, especially when we're working with students with high incidence disabilities that may have a real opinion on what they want to do when they get out of school. Not to say that our students with low incidence disabilities don't necessarily, but sometimes they need more assistance in terms of determining what that would look like and needing more guidance from their parents. But at the age of 14, we are required to invite students to participate, especially when we are talking about those measurable post-secondary goals. Okay, and those need to really look at three areas: training and education. So what kind of training, post-secondary education do these students want to explore? What are they working towards that they want to gain access to? Employment, what kind of jobs they're going to look at, what kind of job assistance do they need, what kind of skills do they need to be able to successfully be in that employment, and then any individual needs that they need assistance with on independent living. So we would also look at that, okay? So for example, I'll give you an example from my personal life. You know, my brother has special needs. He lives independently. He's had the same job for 16 years now, but he does not drive. So one of the things he had in his IEP when he initially was in high school and going through this transition process was transportation. What does that look like? What kind of transportation opportunities does he have in the community that would help him get to work independently without my parents driving him every day? So that's just kind of an example of those independent living needs. Okay, and then the other thing we want to think about here is when a child is 14, like I said, we want to no later than when they're 14 on that IEP, we want to make sure we're inviting them to participate, at least during this time where we're talking about post-secondary goals and transition. One of the other questions that we look at during the quiz, the second one, says the law states that parents are to be involved and provide input. Define the term a person acting as a parent. Okay, what does that look like? Why is it important to know this? Well, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but you guys know that the family unit as we see it and as we interact with it within our students and their home lives looks a lot different maybe than it used to. We've got grandparents raising kids, we've got foster parents, we have relatives that are acting as a parent, and that's why it's really important for us to understand in terms of the law and the IEP process, what does that mean? A person acting as a parent. So if the birth parents are not involved in the education process, who are those people that can be? So we have a person acting as a parent. That's a person such as like a grandparent, a step-parent, a relative that the child's living with. And that person has legal responsibility for the welfare of the child. Okay, that's the important thing there, legal responsibility. The other person that it could be is just an education advocate. Okay, so if that child's been appointed an education advocate, that person should have a letter of appointment from Families Together that tells you their legal rights as that person acting as a parent. And then the third is a foster parent. So if there's a foster parent involved, they will also have that letter of appointment that they will be able to show the IEP team that allows them to participate as the person acting as a parent. And so it's just important for us to know kind of what that looks like, what the legal requirements are for it. So spend some time looking at that in the process handbook and really look at that. I'll give a personal example of what that kind of looks like too when we get into special ed evaluation and referrals in terms of a person acting as a parent and what role they can take in that. So the third question in the quiz is what happens when a student reaches the age of majority in Kansas? Okay, and how does this impact your role as a secondary teacher? So, beginning at the age of 17, the IEP must inform the student and the parents that at the age of majority under state law, okay, I'm reading this right from the process handbook, so we get it right, which is the age of 18 in Kansas, the rights under IDA will transfer to the student. Okay, so as soon as they reach 18, their rights transfer to the student. The school must provide documentation in the IEP at least 1 year before the student is 18 that the student has been informed of the rights provided in the federal and state law that will transfer to the student. So if parents believe that their child may not be able to make educational decisions, they may wish to find out about obtaining limited guardianship or another legal means to support the student upon reaching the age of majority. It's important for the school to provide information and resources to the student and parents early in the IEP process to assist them in understanding the implications of the transfer of these rights under IDEA. The other reason it's important to provide this information to parents really early in the process is it can take some time to obtain guardianship documentation so that the day they turn 18, the parents still have guardianship. My parents went through this with my brother when he turned 18. They had to have documentation from a physician about his intellectual disability that proved that they needed to retain guardianship for him. That takes time. That paperwork takes time to get done. And so if parents are getting, 2-3 months out from the child turning 18 and they're starting to get concerned about guardianship, we need to really be addressing that earlier. When they turn 17, let's start at least providing them with some resources if we think they need it. So that's in place when the child turns 18. So it does impact your role a little bit as a secondary teacher because you could look at dealing with that student as the decision maker rather than the parents being the decision maker in the education process, which is a little unique. Number 4, what's the purpose of the General Ed Intervention, GEI? This is something that I'll let you read about. It's probably something that you're much more familiar with because I would think you deal with it a lot just in your current setting. But of course, it's the General Ed Intervention and looking at how do we identify kids through that General Ed Intervention that need additional supports that are outside the realm of what the General Ed classroom can provide. And kind of what that collaboration looks like between the special ed teacher and the general ed teacher. So I just want you to take a look at those. The 5th question is, what is the role of the parent in the evaluation process? And you probably see a whole range of involvement from parents in terms of the evaluation and the IEP process. But generally, parents provide consent or refuse consent for the evaluation. So they can refuse consent for the evaluation. They can also provide information on kind of their hopes and dreams for their child. long-term hopes and dreams, and short-term for that IEP year hopes and dreams. This is something that we provide for our daughter Josie every year as we do the IEP, to provide a little bit more information for them to use. And sometimes they take those hopes and dreams or those goals that we mention and turn those into goals in the IEP. Sometimes those things are just documented in the IEP, and we look at them again the next year to see if we addressed them. Josie's getting ready to go through her 3-year reeval, so it's a little bit of a bigger evaluation process. And so at times in the past, we have said, hey, we feel like at home we see her struggling with this subject area. Can we maybe look at it in a little bit more detail during the 3-year reeval? So we may ask them to do a little bit more evaluation in that area, and they have the right to refuse that, provide us information on why they refuse that. But typically we have a great working relationship with our IEP team. Typically if we say that there's a concern we kind of like to look at, we look at that together, and they're very willing to do that. But that's another role that parents can play. Number 7, what triggers a referral for the special ed evaluation? Okay, lots of things can trigger a referral. Child find is a really typical thing that triggers a referral with younger kids that are maybe not quite in kindergarten yet, and we're looking at that infant toddler range, the birth to 3, or we're looking at preschool, where they go do a child find activity. They go through a little short evaluation process and kind of identify it as maybe having some areas that they're lagging behind in their peers. And so a larger special ed evaluation is recommended by the district. Parents can also request a referral. They can do that either in writing or they can do that orally. I mentioned earlier about someone being in the role as a parent that's not a parent. We experienced this in our family, who was in 4th grade 2 years ago. And he was really struggling and lagging behind in reading than his peers, and he wasn't identified. He wasn't on an IEP. He was working with a reading specialist, and he had already been held back 1 year previously, so he really should have been in 5th grade. And about January, February, his teachers started talking about they were going to keep him back in 4th grade again, so that meant he would have been held back 2 grades at that point. And he was living with my in-laws at the time. And so I talked to my mother-in-law and said, I think what I would do is request a referral for a special ed evaluation, because we haven't really determined, I haven't heard anyone say why he's struggling so much in reading. Let's just look at it and see, why is he struggling so much in reading? And, my mother-in-law was very concerned about him being retained another year. And I said, well, hey, if he has an IEP, they're not going to be able to retain him. They're going to have to provide him some supports to help him be successful in the classroom. And it really could have been a detriment for him socially at that age to be retained. He lives in Oklahoma, so this is a little different state situation. But she did that. I helped her write a letter asking for a special ed evaluation, and she submitted it to the special ed director. And the district agreed to do that. Now, districts can refuse to do that evaluation. All they have to do is provide a written notice explaining why they don't believe that evaluation is necessary. But in this case, the district did. And the unique thing was, and the great thing was, that they identified, yes, he had a disability in reading. And what we ended up finding at the end was he needed glasses, that he wasn't seeing the words on the page correctly. He ended up having to get some eye therapy to train his eyes to look at words correctly, and spent 2 years on an IEP, and just this year he was signed off, and he is not on an IEP, and he's on grade level. So that was great. So that's an example of maybe a parent being able to have that right to request an evaluation, maybe if a team's just missing something. We've got lots of kids at school, right, with lots of different issues. Sometimes somebody can slip through the cracks. So this gives parents an opportunity to do that. And then if a student is 18 or older, they can do a self-referral. Again, schools may refuse that, but they have to provide written notice for why they're doing that refusal. If we look at some of the transition needs that need to be included, this is question number 8 in the PL-AAFP of students 14 and older. That's basically 3 things. You've got, first, the appropriate measurable post-secondary goals, okay? These are based on age-appropriate transition assessments. We're going to spend a lot of time later in this semester really looking at transition assessments. The second is transition services, so that's the course of study, what does the student need to reach those goals need to be put in place. And then third, beginning at the age of 16, the IEP determining a statement of needed transition services for the child. So that's where we get into those agencies that may be responsible for some of these transition needs. Question 9 looks at what's the purpose of the transition assessment and when is it to be completed and what's the teacher's role. So the transition assessment, again, we're going to spend several weeks looking at transition assessment, looking at putting transition plans into place. I'm pretty excited about really getting into that in detail. So we're going to just kind of gloss over it right now as you look at the process handbook. But the purpose of the transition assessment is to provide information to develop and write practical post-secondary goals, okay, and identify those transition services that the student needs to reach those goals. So the assessment has to be conducted prior to the student turning 14, okay, that's important to remember for the law, and prior to the development of the measurable goals, okay. So for each goal, there has to be evidence of at least one age-appropriate assessment that was used to provide information on that student's needs, their strengths, their weaknesses, their areas of interest regarding that goal. And most of that evidence is going to be found in the student file. So we're going to look at some tools that are out there for transition assessment and some things that you can just take away and use in your classroom that I think are going to be really helpful as you just kind of expand your knowledge base on those transition assessments. And then the last question, and this is one where you're going to just want to kind of dig into that handbook and look at things that really stick out to you. Present and discuss one item from the handbook that you would consider important to know. This should be something that you want to remember. So I will say one thing for me, because I didn't spend quite as much time in high school as I did in elementary and middle school, is the fact that students 14 must be invited to attend if the purpose of the meeting is to talk about their post-secondary goals and transition services. And the interesting thing is that even if the parents don't want the child to attend, they must be invited to attend. But the parents, of course, still retain, the educational, the authority to make those educational decisions for the child and make the final determination. But it's really important to start getting students involved at that age in terms of what does it look like as we work towards getting you out of school. What are your goals? What are things that you want to do as you become an adult? And so that was something that just really stuck out to me. So, over the course of this week, really look at that process handbook. Spend time really covering in your own words what your answers are for these questions and providing the correct reference. If you answer a question and there's no APA reference within that answer, I'm going to send it back to you because I know that you probably don't have all of that just in your head with no reference from where that information came from. I know you had to get it somewhere. So just provide that reference and use the tools that we've already looked at in class and what that looks like. If you wanted me to take a look at one of your answers or several of your answers and say, hey, am I on the right track? Am I covering this in the appropriate detail? Most of them are going to have 4, 5, 6 sentences at least in them. Am I doing the correct things with my referencing? Send it to me. Shoot me an email. Give me at least a day before it's due to look at it. But I'm glad to provide that feedback because this is really important for you to know. This is how we get ourselves in trouble in the classroom, especially with IEPs, is if we don't know the law because we're just not following it correctly. And, we can get behind the 8 ball there. So I really want you to understand how important it is to understand the process handbook, how to find information in it, how to use it, how to pull out that information, really put it in your own words so that you understand it clearly. So don't hesitate to get in touch with me if you have any questions.